The morning sun peeked through the clouds as Eleanor Wright carefully applied her light pink lipstick in her bathroom mirror. She wasn't one for much makeup these days, just enough to feel put together. At 68, she had long stopped trying to impress others, but old habits from her working days remained. Another day of paperwork, she muttered to herself, tucking a loose strand of silver hair back into her simple bun. 3 months had passed since Harold's funeral, and the list of things to handle seemed never-ending. Today's task: withdraw money to pay the contractors who were fixing the roof. Eleanor chose her most comfortable outfit, a well-worn blue cardigan over a simple blouse, paired with loose-fitting slacks and shoes that wouldn't hurt her feet. No one paid much attention to older women anyway, she thought, especially not at busy places like Riverside Financial. The bus dropped her off just a block from the bank. Eleanor could have called her driver, but she preferred public transport these days. It kept her connected to real life, to ordinary people. Something Harold had always appreciated about her: she never acted like money had changed her. As she pushed open the heavy glass doors of Riverside Financial, Eleanor was met with the familiar sounds of a busy weekday. Phones ringing, keyboards clicking, the low hum of conversations. The bank had been remodeled since her last visit almost a year ago. Fancy new counters with sleek computers replaced the old wooden desks she remembered. "Can I help you find something, ma'am?" asked a young security guard, eyeing her comfortable clothes and simple handbag. "Just waiting for a teller, thank you," Eleanor replied with a kind smile. The guard nodded and pointed her toward the waiting area. Eleanor took her place in line behind a young couple arguing about their mortgage and a businessman who kept checking his watch every 30 seconds. She didn't mind the wait. Patience was something she had in abundance these days. After 20 minutes, it was finally her turn. The teller, a young man with tired eyes and a forced smile, waved her forward without looking up from his computer. "Next customer, please." Eleanor approached the counter and placed her old leather wallet on the surface. "Good morning. I'd like to make a withdrawal, please." The young man, his nameplate read Tyler, barely glanced at her. "Savings or checking?" "Checking, please. I need $15,000. Tyler's fingers, which had been rapidly typing, suddenly froze. He looked up, really seeing her for the first time. His eyes narrowed slightly. $15,000. In cash?" Eleanor nodded. "Yes, please. I have contractors starting work on my house tomorrow." Tyler cleared his throat. Do you have your ID, ma'am? And your account number?" Eleanor opened her wallet and handed over her driver's license along with a neatly folded check with her account information. She noticed how Tyler scrutinized her ID, looking back and forth between her face and the photo several times. "One moment, please," he said, standing up. "I need to speak with my supervisor." As Tyler walked away, Eleanor noticed how he leaned close to a woman in an expensive suit, whispering while occasionally glancing back at her. The woman's eyebrows rose as she looked Eleanor's way. The supervisor approached with a professional smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Hello, Mrs. Wright. I'm Diane, the branch manager. I understand you're trying to withdraw a large sum today." "That's right," Eleanor replied. $15,000. Diane's smile tightened. "And this is for house repairs, you mentioned." "Yes, my roof needs replacing and the contractors start tomorrow." Diane folded her hands on the counter. "Mrs. Wright, we're always concerned when our older clients request such large cash withdrawals. There are many scams targeting seniors these days. Perhaps you'd like to use a cashier's check instead. Or maybe you have a family member who helps with your finances." Eleanor felt a familiar tightness in her chest, that same feeling she'd experienced countless times throughout her career when people underestimated her. She kept her voice steady. "I appreciate your concern, but I would like the cash, please. I've been banking here for over 40 years. Diane's smile disappeared completely. "I'm sorry, but I'm going to need additional verification for such a large withdrawal. It's for your own protection. Perhaps you could come back tomorrow with a family member who can help explain the process." Eleanor looked at her for a long moment, then quietly collected her ID and account information. "I see," she said softly. "I'll come back another time then." As she turned to leave, Eleanor checked her watch. She had exactly 2 hours before the quarterly board meeting upstairs. just enough time to change into something more appropriate for the chairwoman of Riverside Financial's board of directors. Eleanor walked out of Riverside Financial with her head held high, despite the burning feeling of humiliation in her chest. The fresh air cooled her flushed cheeks as she made her way toward the small coffee shop across the street. She needed a moment to collect herself. "The usual, Mrs. Wright?" asked the barista, a kind-faced young woman who had served Eleanor countless times before. "Yes, please, Rita. And maybe one of those blueberry muffins, too." Eleanor found comfort in small rituals, especially on difficult days. As she waited for her order, Eleanor pulled out her phone and dialed a number. "Hello, Lisa. It's Eleanor. Would you mind bringing my navy suit to the back entrance of Riverside in about an hour?" "Yes, the board meeting is today." She paused, listening. "No, everything's fine. I just had an interesting experience with our customer service." Coffee in hand, Eleanor found a quiet corner table and opened the folder of paperwork she'd brought. She wasn't truly focusing on the documents. Her mind kept replaying the interaction at the bank. It wasn't the first time someone had dismissed her because of her age or gender, but it stung nonetheless. "Needs a family member to help explain the process," she muttered, shaking her head. Elena had spent 43 years in banking. She had started as a secretary right out of high school, worked her way through college at night, and eventually rose to become one of the most respected financial advisors in the state. When she married Harold Wright, the owner of Riverside Financial, many assumed she would retire. Instead, she continued working behind the scenes, guiding major decisions, while Harold became the public face of the institution. Now that Harold was gone, the 52% controlling interest had passed to her. Most of the upper management knew this, but clearly that information hadn't filtered down to the branch level. Her phone buzzed with a text from Lisa. "Outside in 30 minutes with your suit. Board packet is ready too." Elena finished her coffee and gathered her things. Instead of heading straight back to the bank, she walked 2 blocks to the park where she and Harold used to sit during lunch breaks in their early days together. The memory brought both sadness and strength. "You'd have found this funny, wouldn't you?" she said quietly, looking at the empty space beside her on the bench. Harold had always appreciated the irony of situations. He would have laughed about his wife being denied access to her own money at her own bank. 50 minutes later, Eleanor emerged from the executive bathroom at Riverside Financial looking like a completely different person. Gone was the comfortable cardigan and simple bun. Now she wore a tailored navy suit, pearl earrings, and her silver hair was arranged in an elegant style. Lisa, her assistant of 15 years, stood waiting with a leather portfolio. "The quarterly reports are on top, followed by the audit committee findings," Lisa explained. "Oh, and Diane Thompson from the main branch sent up a request to discuss customer experience enhancements at today's meeting. Should I have added it to the agenda?" Elena smiled for the first time that day. "Diane Thompson, branch manager downstairs." "Yes, that's her. She's been pushing for this meeting for weeks. Very ambitious, that one." "By all means, add her to the agenda," Eleanor said. "I'm quite interested in her thoughts on customer experience." The executive floor of Riverside Financial was a different world from the public banking area downstairs. Plushed carpeting, wood-paneled walls, and hushed conversations created an atmosphere of old money and power. As Eleanor approached the boardroom, the regional director, Paul Jenkins, hurried to greet her. "Mrs. Wright, what a pleasure to have you joining us in person today. It's been too long." "Yes, it has, Paul. Since Harold's passing, I thought it was time to take a more visible role." Of course. The board is already seated, and we've invited Diane Thompson from downstairs to present her customer service initiative. I hope that's all right." Eleanor nodded. "Actually, I'm looking forward to it." Paul opened the heavy boardroom door, and conversations immediately hushed as 12 pairs of eyes turned toward them. "Ladies and gentlemen," Paul announced, "please welcome Mrs. Eleanor Wright, majority shareholder and chairwoman of Riverside Financial." Elena smiled as she walked to the head of the table, noting with satisfaction the shocked expression on Diane's face as recognition slowly dawned. "Thank you all for coming," Eleanor said calmly, setting her portfolio on the table. "Before we begin our usual agenda, I'd like to discuss my recent experience as a customer at our main branch. I think it might inform our discussion on customer service quite effectively. The boardroom fell silent as Eleanor took her seat at the head of the table. 12 pairs of eyes watched her, some curious, some nervous, and one pair belonging to Diane Thompson that were now wide with shock. As I was saying, Eleanor continued calmly, I had quite the educational experience as a customer this morning. She poured herself a glass of water, taking her time. Before we dive into quarterly numbers, I think it might be valuable to discuss what happened. Paul Jenkins, the regional director, leaned forward. Mrs. Wright, is everything all right? Was there some sort of issue with your account? Eleanor smiled. Well, that depends on who you ask. According to Jon Tyler at the front counter and branch manager Diane here, I might be confused or possibly the target of a scam. All heads turned toward Diane, whose face had drained of color. She gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles turning white. I don't understand, Diane stammered, though her expression suggested she was beginning to understand all too well. Let me refresh your memory, Eleanor said. About 2 hours ago, a woman in a blue cardigan came to your branch requesting a withdrawal of $15,000. You suggested she was confused and recommended she return with a family member who could help her understand the process. Eleanor's voice remained pleasant, but there was steel beneath her words. Diane swallowed hard. Mrs. Wright, that was you? I had no idea. Clearly, Eleanor interrupted, not unkindly. And that's precisely my point. You had no idea who I was, so you treated me like I was incapable of managing my own finances. An uncomfortable silence filled the room. The other board members shifted in their seats, some looking down at their papers, others watching the exchange with undisguised interest. I wasn't dressed like this, Eleanor gestured to her tailored suit. I didn't introduce myself as the majority shareholder. I was just an ordinary older woman asking for her own money. The CFO, a man in his 60s named Robert Chen, cleared his throat. Eleanor, I'm sorry this happened. It's completely unacceptable. Actually, Robert, I'm not looking for apologies, Eleanor replied. What I'm interested in is understanding if this is how all our older customers are treated, or if I was special somehow. Diane finally found her voice again. Mrs. Wright, we have protocols for large withdrawals. It was nothing personal, I assure you. Interesting, Eleanor said. She opened her leather portfolio and pulled out a document. Because according to our own customer service guidelines, which I helped write 15 years ago, by the way, there's nothing in the protocol about requiring family members to be present for transactions. She slid the document across the table. What it does say is that proper ID should be verified and unusual activity should be flagged. My withdrawal wasn't unusual for my account history. Paul Jenkins ran a hand through his graying hair. This is concerning, very concerning. I agree, Eleanor said, but it's also an opportunity. Diane, I believe you were scheduled to present some ideas about improving customer experience today. Diane looked like she might faint. Yes, but perhaps we should reschedule. Nonsense, Eleanor said firmly. I'm very interested in your ideas, especially now. With shaking hands, Diane opened her presentation folder. Well, I was going to suggest implementing a customer feedback system and additional training for our staff on handling special cases. Special cases? Eleanor raised an eyebrow. What exactly does that mean? Different types of customers with different needs, Diane explained, her confidence returning slightly as she moved into familiar territory, including elderly clients who might need extra assistance. Eleanor nodded thoughtfully. And what kind of assistance do you think elderly clients need, Diane? The room grew tense again. Everyone could see the trap being laid. Well, sometimes they need help understanding modern banking practices or technology, Diane said carefully. I see, Eleanor replied. And you determine this need based on what exactly? Their age? Their appearance? Before Diane could answer, the door opened and Lisa poked her head in. Sorry to interrupt, Mrs. Wright, but the contractor's called. They need approval on the roofing materials before they start tomorrow. Thank you, Lisa. Please tell them I'll call in an hour. The $15,000 should be ready by then. Eleanor turned back to the table. That is, unless anyone else thinks I need a family member to help me understand how to pay for a new roof. No one spoke. Even Diane managed a small, embarrassed smile at the gentle rebuke. "Now," Eleanor said, tapping the quarterly report in front of her, "let's talk about our true purpose today. But first, I'd like to propose a new initiative, one where our executives spend time experiencing our bank as regular customers. I think we might all learn something valuable, don't you?" The board members nodded in agreement, and Eleanor noticed with satisfaction that several of them were looking at her with new respect in their eyes. The board meeting progressed smoothly after the initial tension. Eleanor guided the discussions with the skill of someone who had spent decades in the banking world. She asked pointed questions about quarterly profits, challenged assumptions in the marketing plan, and offered insights that made several board members scribble notes furiously. Through it all, Diane sat quietly, speaking only when directly addressed. The confident branch manager from earlier had been replaced by someone desperately trying to become invisible. Tyler, the young teller, had been called up to the meeting room as well and stood nervously by the door, unsure why he was there. "Now let's discuss our community engagement numbers," Eleanor said, flipping to the next page in her portfolio. "I see our customer retention rate has dropped 3% in the last quarter. Any thoughts on why?" Paul Jenkins cleared his throat. "We believe it's due to the new online bank that opened. They're offering higher interest rates on savings accounts." Eleanor nodded. "That's certainly a factor. But I wonder if there might be something else at play." She glanced toward Diane and Tyler. "Perhaps how we make our customers feel when they come into our branches." The room grew quiet again. "Mrs. Wright," Robert Chen ventured, "are you suggesting that customer service is impacting our retention rates?" "I'm not just suggesting it, Robert. I'm certain of it." Eleanor closed her portfolio. "For the past 6 months, I've been visiting different branches of our bank. Not as Eleanor Wright, the owner, but as Eleanor Wright, an ordinary customer." Surprised murmurs rippled through the room. "My late husband always said you could tell the true character of a business by how they treat their most vulnerable customers," Eleanor continued. "So I decided to see for myself. I've opened accounts, applied for loans, and made withdrawals at 12 different branches." "And what did you find?" asked Linda Powell, the bank's HR director. "I found a concerning pattern," Eleanor replied. "The younger and more professionally dressed I appeared, the better service I received. The older and more casually dressed, the more likely I was to be spoken to slowly, as if I couldn't understand basic banking concepts." Tyler shifted uncomfortably by the door. "Today's experience wasn't unique," Eleanor continued. "It was just the most blatant example. And if I'm being treated this way as a customer, I can only imagine how many other older people are experiencing the same thing, people who don't have the power to call a board meeting afterward." "This is troubling," Paul said, looking genuinely concerned. "What do you propose we do?" Eleanor smiled. "I'm glad you asked. I've prepared some recommendations." She reached into her bag and pulled out a folder, which Lisa distributed copies of around the table. "First, I believe we need comprehensive training for all customer-facing staff on respectful engagement with older clients. Second, I want to implement a mystery shopper program where people of various ages and backgrounds evaluate our customer service. And third," she paused, looking directly at Diane and Tyler, "I want to create a special task force to develop these initiatives, led by people who understand exactly why this matters." Diane looked up, surprised. "You want me on this task force? After what happened?" "Especially because of what happened," Eleanor replied. "You've just received the most effective training possible on why this matters, and I suspect you won't make the same mistake twice." Tyler stepped forward hesitantly. "Mrs. Wright, if I may, I'm really sorry about earlier. I didn't mean to be disrespectful." Eleanor considered him for a moment. "I know you didn't, Tyler. Most biases aren't intentional. That's what makes them so difficult to address. But acknowledging them is the first step toward changing them." She turned back to the board. "I'd like Diane and Tyler to spend the next month developing this program. They'll report directly to me. And to ensure they understand the customer perspective fully, I'd like them to visit our competitor banks, dressed as I was today, and attempt similar transactions." Diane's eyes widened. "You want us to experience what you experienced?" "Exactly," Eleanor nodded. "Sometimes the best way to understand a problem is to live it yourself." As the meeting adjourned, Board members approached Eleanor one by one, expressing their support for her initiative. Some shared stories of their own parents or grandparents facing similar treatment at other businesses. "You know," Robert Chen said quietly as they were leaving, "Harold would be proud of how you're handling this." Elena smiled, feeling a warmth in her chest at the mention of her late husband. He always did say that sometimes life's most uncomfortable moments lead to the most important changes. The following morning, Eleanor arrived at her office on the top floor of Riverside Financial's headquarters. The space was elegant but understated, much like Eleanor herself. Family photos lined the shelves, including several of Harold in his fishing gear, grinning proudly with his catches. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called. Lisa poked her head in. "Diane and Tyler are here for their 9 o'clock meeting." Eleanor nodded. "Send them in, please." Diane entered first, wearing a crisp suit and a tense smile. Tyler followed, his tie slightly crooked and his face showing signs of a sleepless night. Both stood awkwardly until Eleanor gestured to the chairs in front of her desk. "Please have a seat. Would either of you like coffee?" Eleanor asked. "No, thank you," Diane replied quickly. "I'm fine, thank you, Mrs. Wright," Tyler added, his voice cracking slightly. Eleanor studied them for a moment. "You both look worried." "There's no need for that. This isn't a punishment assignment." Diane cleared her throat. "With all due respect, Mrs. Wright, it feels a bit like punishment. We made a mistake, and now we have to go undercover to other banks and, well, be treated poorly. Is that what you think this is about? Getting a taste of your own medicine?" Eleanor asked, her tone curious rather than accusatory. Tyler looked at the floor. "Isn't it?" Eleanor leaned back in her chair. "If that were my goal, I'd simply have fired you both yesterday." "That would have been easier, wouldn't it?" Neither responded. "Let me tell you a story," Eleanor continued. "When I was 22, I applied for my first bank job. The manager asked if I could type, and when I said yes, he immediately offered me a secretary position, despite my business degree. He never even considered me for the financial analyst role I had actually applied for." She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city below. "I took that secretary job and worked harder than anyone else. I learned everything I could. When I met Harold 10 years later, I was managing my own small branch. Many people assumed I married him for his money and position as the bank's owner." Eleanor turned back to face them. "The truth is, Harold sought my advice long before he sought my hand in marriage. He recognized something that others missed because they couldn't see past my gender or, later, my age." She returned to her desk. "That's what happened with you two yesterday. You saw an older woman and made assumptions." Diane nodded slowly. "I understand that now, and I'm truly sorry." "Being sorry isn't enough," Eleanor said firmly. "I want you to understand why it happens and how it feels. That's why you'll be visiting other banks, not as punishment, but as education." Tyler straightened in his chair. "So it would be like undercover agents." A small smile crossed Eleanor's face. "Something like that. You'll dress down, wear some gray in your hair, speak a little more slowly perhaps. Then you'll request services and document how you're treated. And this will help us develop the new training program." Diane asked, beginning to understand. "Exactly. The best training comes from real experience. I could lecture you about respect and dignity for hours, but feeling it firsthand will teach you more than my words ever could." Diane tapped her pen thoughtfully against her notepad. "Mrs. Wright, I've been thinking about this all night. I've worked in banking for 12 years, and I've probably done this to countless customers without realizing it." "Probably," Eleanor agreed. "That's why recognizing it matters so much. Banking isn't just about money, it's about people's dignity, their independence. For many older people, managing their own money is one of the last pieces of control they have." Tyler nodded, real understanding dawning on his face. "My grandmother mentioned something similar last night when I called her. She said her bank teller talks to her daughter instead of to her, even when she's standing right there." "And how does that make your grandmother feel?" Eleanor asked gently. "Invisible," Tyler replied quietly. "She said it makes her feel invisible." Eleanor nodded. "That's the heart of it. When we dismiss people based on their age or appearance, we make them invisible. And no one deserves that, especially not customers trusting us with their life savings. Diane opened her notebook with new determination. I'd like to start by reviewing our training materials. I think I now see several problems with how we instruct staff to handle special situations. Good, Eleanor said, pleased by the shift in Diane's attitude. And Tyler, I'd like you to work with our older customers directly, get their feedback on how we can serve them better. I'd actually like to start with my grandmother, Tyler suggested, his nervousness replaced with enthusiasm. She's got strong opinions on everything, especially customer service. Eleanor smiled. For the first time since the meeting began, she felt certain that something good would come from yesterday's humiliation. Sometimes the right people just needed the right push to see differently. 2 weeks later, Eleanor sat in her favorite armchair at home, reading through the first reports from Diane and Tyler's undercover visits. Outside, rain tapped against the windows, creating a peaceful backdrop to her evening. She smiled as she turned the pages, impressed by the detail of their observations. The doorbell rang, interrupting her reading. Eleanor wasn't expecting visitors, especially not on a rainy Tuesday evening. She opened the door to find Diane standing on her porch, hair damp from the rain, and holding a thick folder. "Diane, is everything all right?" Eleanor asked, surprised. "I'm sorry to bother you at home, Mrs. Wright," Diane said, "but I couldn't wait until tomorrow's meeting to share this with you." Eleanor stepped aside. "Come in, please. You're getting soaked." Inside, Eleanor made tea while Diane nervously arranged papers on the coffee table. There was something different about the branch manager, a humility that hadn't been there before. "So," Eleanor said, setting down 2 steaming cups, "what couldn't wait until morning?" Diane took a deep breath. "I've completed 12 undercover visits to different banks, including 3 of our own branches." She pushed the folder across the table. "But yesterday something happened that, well, it changed everything for me." Eleanor opened the folder, scanning the first page of notes. "I visited First National on Main Street," Diane continued. "I wore a gray wig, some glasses, and clothes I borrowed from my mother. I requested information about refinancing my mortgage." Eleanor looked up, and "They treated me like I was completely incompetent," Diane said, her voice tight with emotion. "The loan officer spoke to me like I was a child. When I asked questions about interest rates, he said I shouldn't worry my head about complicated financial matters and suggested I bring my son next time." Eleanor nodded, having experienced similar treatment countless times. "But that's not what I needed to tell you," Diane continued. "After that appointment, I went to visit my mother at her nursing home. She's 76 and has some memory issues, but she's still sharp about many things." Diane's eyes welled with tears. "I realized I've been treating her exactly the same way that loan officer treated me. Speaking over her head to her nurses, making decisions without asking her opinion, assuming she couldn't understand things." Eleanor set down the folder. "That's a difficult realization." "It's worse than difficult. It's heartbreaking," Diane said. "I saw myself through her eyes for the first time. And then I remembered how I spoke to you that day at the bank. Outside, the rain grew heavier, drumming against the roof. You know what my mother said when I apologized to her?" Diane continued. "She said, 'It's about time you noticed. She's been feeling invisible for years, and I never realized I was contributing to that.'" Eleanor reached across and patted Diane's hand. "Recognition is the first step toward change." "I spent the whole day with her," Diane said, really listening to her for the first time in years. She had so much to say, so many opinions I'd been ignoring because I thought I knew better. Diane pulled another document from the folder. "So I stayed up all night working on this. It's a completely revised training program based on both my undercover experiences and what I learned from my mother." Eleanor skimmed the document, impressed by the thoughtfulness of the approach. It focused not just on procedures, but on the human element of banking, dignity, respect, and real listening. "This is excellent work, Diane," Eleanor said. "Truly excellent." "There's more," Diane said, pulling out her phone and showing Eleanor a video. "Tyler's been visiting senior centers and recording interviews about banking experiences. With permission, of course. He's collected dozens of stories that we can use in our training." The video showed an elderly man describing how a teller had refused to cash his check without his daughter present, despite his valid ID. "We're calling the program Banking with Dignity," Diane explained, "and we'd like to start implementing it next month, if you approve." Elena felt a wave of satisfaction. This was exactly what she hoped for, not just compliance, but genuine understanding and change. "You know," Eleanor said, setting down her tea, "when Harold and I were building this bank, he always said that numbers were important, but people mattered more. I think he would be very proud of what you're creating here." Diane smiled, the first genuine smile Eleanor had seen from her. "Thank you for not firing me that day, Mrs. Wright. It would have been easier for you, but I would have missed the most important lesson of my career." "Sometimes," Eleanor replied, "the hardest experiences teach us the most valuable lessons." 6 months later, the main lobby of Riverside Financial was decorated with blue and silver balloons. A large banner hung above the teller windows, reading "Banking with Dignity, 1 year of making a difference." Staff members wore special pins on their lapels, and Eleanor couldn't help but smile as she walked through the doors. The young security guard, who had once directed her to the waiting area with barely a glance, now greeted her by name. "Good morning, Mrs. Wright. Big day today, isn't it?" "Indeed it is, Carl. Are they all upstairs already?" Eleanor asked. "Yes, ma'am. And the TV crew arrived about 10 minutes ago." Eleanor nodded her thanks and headed for the elevators. The past 6 months had brought remarkable changes to Riverside Financial. The Banking with Dignity program had started as an internal training initiative but had grown into something much bigger. Other banks had noticed their approach, and now financial institutions across the state were adopting similar programs. The conference room was packed when Eleanor arrived. Board members mingled with branch managers and frontline staff. In the corner, a local news crew was setting up cameras. At the center of it all stood Diane and Tyler, explaining the program to an attentive group of visitors from other banks. "Mrs. Wright." Tyler spotted her and waved her over. "We were just showing everyone the training videos. They've been a huge hit." Elena joined them, noting how confident Tyler had become. No longer the nervous teller who could barely meet her eyes, he now spoke with authority about customer service and dignity. The key was listening to people's actual experiences, Diane was explaining to the group. "We conducted over 200 interviews with older customers about their banking experiences, good and bad. And don't forget the mystery shopper program," Tyler added. Having bank employees experience being treated dismissively firsthand was eye-opening for everyone. A woman from another bank raised her hand. "Did you face any resistance implementing these changes?" "Initially, yes," Diane admitted. "Change is always challenging. But once people understood the why behind it, most came around quickly." Elena watched with pride. The program had far exceeded her expectations. Customer satisfaction scores had risen dramatically, and Riverside had been featured in Banking Monthly magazine as an industry leader in inclusive service. After a few minutes, Paul Jenkins tapped a glass for attention. "If everyone could take their seats, we're about to begin the official presentation." As people settled in, Eleanor found herself seated between Diane and an elderly gentleman she didn't recognize. "Mrs. Wright," the man said, extending his hand. "I'm George Wilson. I just wanted to thank you personally for what you've done here." Eleanor shook his hand. "It's lovely to meet you, Mr. Wilson, but I'm afraid I don't understand. What have I done for you?" The man smiled. "I've banked here for 43 years. For the last decade, I'd felt like I was becoming invisible as I got older. But about 4 months ago, something changed. The staff started talking to me instead of around me. They explained things clearly without talking down to me. They treated me like a person again, not just an old man." Eleanor felt a lump form in her throat. "That means a great deal to hear, Mr. Wilson. When I found out about this program and who was behind it, I asked if I could be here today. You've given many of us our dignity back, Mrs. Wright." Before Eleanor could respond, Paul called her to the podium. As she walked to the front of the room, she caught sight of a familiar face in the back. Lisa had brought a framed photo of Harold, placing it on the credenza where it could watch the proceedings. "Good morning, everyone," Eleanor began. "A year ago, I walked into this bank dressed in a comfortable cardigan and was denied access to my own money. Today, we're celebrating how that uncomfortable moment transformed not just Riverside Financial, but how we think about customer service across the banking industry. She glanced at Diane and Tyler, who were watching her with genuine smiles. What began as a lesson for two employees has become a movement. Banking with dignity is now being adopted by 15 other financial institutions. We've trained over 500 bank employees and received thank you letters from more than 1,000 customers. Eleanor paused, looking around the room. But the numbers, impressive as they are, don't tell the real story. The real story is about people like Mr. George Wilson, who no longer feels invisible when he comes to do his banking. It's about my friend Dorothy, who recently told me that for the first time in years, a teller asked for her ID instead of her daughter's when cashing a check. She smiled at the assembled crowd. True wealth isn't measured by what we can withdraw, but by the respect we deposit in others. Thank you all for helping make that lesson a reality.